Well, another Monday is here, and I was thinking about some of the stories and stuff that I, kind of have stored in my frontal lobe here. I have a tendency to remember things. Sometimes I remember things that other people don't. They wonder how I can remember so much. But I've got a couple of three little funny things to talk about here, and I got something I can show you. I'm going to pick it up and show it to you in a minute. But this Windstar here was a 95. When Ford first came out with Windstars, they basically became the trendsetter for a while, because it seemed like every time you looked at a van for one of these little minivans for a while, that they had the shape of a Ford Windstar. But this was one. The way that it started out, I was working at the dealership. The Windstars were brand new. They had just come out. It was in 95. May have been late 94, actually, I think. But anyhow, they brought me this one to work on because it had a problem. And anytime you're working on a new platform, if you've worked at a dealership and you get to work on all the cutting edge stuff, you see peculiar stuff at the dealer that you may not see at the in an independent shop. One of the things that we used to run into a lot of the time in my early days of working at the Ford dealer, back whenever the old Duraspark ignition systems were still prevalent on a lot of stuff, is whenever I was working at independent shops, it seems like if the electronic ignition system went dark on a Ford, it was always the module on the fender. You could plug another one of those in really quick, and in those days they were about $100, but then now they're down to, like, last time I bought one, I think it was 20 bucks or something like that. They don't cost that much now. But the point is, those things would have already been swapped out by the time it got to the dealer. And every time we saw one at the dealer, it was a doggone stator in a distributor or some crazy something that wasn't like I hardly ever saw. Another anomaly I ran into, well, I was at school sometimes. I'd be in Tennessee or up over in Atlanta or somewhere in a school, and we would be talking about the different problems that we were seeing on these vehicles. And I would say, we've been replacing a lot of throttle position sensors on Ford Aerostars. And the other mechanics would say, well, we hadn't replaced any throttle position sensors, but we've seen a lot of bad mass airflow sensors. And I'm thinking, what the heck is the common denominator here? Why are they having that problem up there and we're having the problem we're having down here? Because it's not like you could just change one part or the other and it would fix all the trouble. Anyway, one way or another, this is a couple of schematics here. I basically pieced these schematics together so you can see the whole thing. This was the early 94, the early build before October 94 of the 95 Windstar power door locks. And I notice you got these actuators here. You've got a rear door lock switch. That's the one that's supposed to be back there in the back. When you open the cargo area on the right side over there, you would see a switch. That's where that switch was. You notice these are directly connected to the door locks, and they basically do a little polarity reversal. They go back and forth. You get a little circuit breaker right here. Now this one here is the one that came out after 1994. Now I'm going to tell you, this one right here is not going to be one that has keyless entry on it, because keyless entry always uses relays. And even though you may not have had keyless entry, you were still subject to have a power door lock system with relays. Then basically the way the relay works is the relay that's at rest is always providing ground, and the one that switches is going to switch and provide power to the other side and all that. So you got at rest, you got this ground that's there. This one here is grounded too. So you're going to ground that one, and then whenever you trigger the door lock relay, this one here is just going to stay where it is, and it's going to provide the ground and all that. And then you got this memory lock relay and all that hogwash. Anyway. Now, this is interesting to me because I got this from ALLDATA. This is all I could find on ALLDATA. Now, ALLDATA also had one of those interactive wiring schematics and all that, which had the keyless entry. They did not have the OE keyless entry schematic in ALLDATA, but they did have it in MotoLogic when I looked in there. And that's what we got right here. Here's your little switch on the door, and basically you got your you know, the door locks down here. There's your little locks. A lift gate lock motor is on there, and then you got your right door and all, and you know you still got a rear door lock switch on that one there. But on these right here, they're basically sending signals to that, to the keyless entry. Now, the problem that I had with this one, they had just purchased the vehicle, and the door locks didn't work, and I found a blown fuse. As soon as I put a fuse in there and tried to operate the door locks, it popped the fuse again. Well, this is going to be a, you know, whenever you're working on one that's was built in the factory, sometimes they'll run a screw through a wire harness, or they'll have it routed some kind of way where it's chafing against a sharp piece of metal or something like that. And so I went to work on this dadgum thing, and I worked on it trying to track down what the problem was, you know. And it didn't matter if you used a switch in the back or if you used any of the switches on the doors. And so I pulled I gutted this thing, trying to figure it out, trying to find anything. I removed all the trim and all the wire harnesses, just gutted it all out of there, so I could follow the harnesses all the way from one end to the other. And I really was having a rough time with this. Well, it just so happened that Eddie Clark was in the dealership, and he was a guy that was a field service rep for Chrysler and Jeep at the time, or Chrysler and Jeep were at the time the same outfit. And so one day whenever he came in there, I had gone over there, and he was looking at a report of how these Jeeps, sometimes when you would start them up, they'd run away. Well, I'd already found one of those, and this guy had his towed in from some place off. It was a Cherokee, and he says he cranked it up and the engine ran away, and he said, I'm not going to ever drive this thing again until you can assure me that it's fixed. And so I went walking out there, and the first thing I looked at, whenever I looked in the window, and I saw that the floor mat was bunched up and was holding the gas pedal down, and just holding it just above idle. And he thought there was something bad wrong with it, and it was designed wrong and all that stuff. And so I took a picture of that. I had a little $150 cheap digital camera at the time that I was using, because I had, you know, stuff to do with where I needed to take digital photos. So and digital cameras were hard to come by back then too, by the way. But anyway, I popped that picture of that thing, and that's, you know, that was basically the only fix that was needed on that one. But apparently that had been an issue, and Eddie was trying to figure out what the deal was on that. And I said, well, all you got to do, if you hold your throttle up, you know, it's not going to see closed. It's looking at closed throttle, whatever it sees when you start it up. And whenever you let it off, it goes below that. You know, you're going to have some issues or wacky stuff. Anyway, I showed Eddie that on one that he came to look at on another day. Well, this day he came and he was going to look at this Grand Cherokee that was given some kind of a problem that required a field service engineer's input. But the Grand Cherokee hadn't showed up, so he was just cooling his heels there at the dealership. And he came over there where I had this Ford Windstar all tore apart, and he was really interested in seeing Ford's new Windstar, because he was a competitive make kind of a guy. And so he just watched me work on that thing for a while, and we talked and passed and repassed while I was scratching my head trying to find that thing. And the problem I found out had been caused by a dadgum salesman. And what had happened was the person that bought the van noticed that all the other vans, or a lot of the other ones, had a power door lock switch, or a power, you know, rear door lock switch back here in the back. But his had keyless entry, and so when Ford built that one, they felt like, well, why does anybody need a door lock switch back here by the hatch whenever you've got a fob in your hand? So they went ahead and just put a little blind plug there in that place where that switch was supposed to go, and there were the wires were behind it. So the salesman, and they didn't tell me this until after I'd fought with the darn thing for a while, the salesman figured he was just really going to be, oh, I can put a switch in, so he ordered a switch that was the right color. You know, they had the little trim panel around it, was the right color, and he plugged those wires in, and he popped that thing in there. And that's when the fuses started blowing, because the way that early one was wired, if you put a switch back there, it would pop the fuse if it had keyless entry. So anyway, that was annoying as all get out. By the time that was all over with, I had burned 4 hours working on one that there was going to be no flag time on. I mean, there should have been, but you know how that works. You know, you're supposed to get flagged for something because it wasn't my fault that the dadgum salesman did this and then didn't tell anybody about it. And so, but the way I was getting paid at the time, they were paying me a guarantee plus whatever I turned over that, and you know, that burned up some of my time, but it wasn't that big of a deal, you know, because because of the way I got paid. Now, if I'd have been a straight commission guy, I would have been really ticked off. But there was about 90 hours, and I'm going somewhere where this is all part of the same story, and it's kind of funny. There was about 90 hours of drivability work coming in, and the service manager, he was one of these guys at the time that was always stirring up the puppies. He was always trying to pack everything. If that guy could, he would have had one service bay for each mechanic. And there was a lot of service bays at that big shop there, and we all had a flat stall and a lift. Now I had 2 flat stalls because most of the work I did was drivability work, and I could put a fuel pump in something really fast, even jack it up, putting stands under it, you know. But the long and the short of it was, he was calling me and the other 2 drivability guys because he kept, you know, hiring more drivability guys. If there's only 90 hours, he hired one more drivability guy because I was swamped. And then me and that guy were each turning about 45 hours a week. And then he hired a 3rd drivability guy, and that guy, we wound up turning 30 hours a week. The same amount of work was coming into the shop every week, no matter how many drivability guys you had. So he basically shaved us all down, and he was acting like it was our fault because we weren't turning more drivability hours than we were. And so I said, well, what about this WinStar that I spent all that time working on the other day? And he says, well, I don't know if you're going to get flagged anything for that or not. And I says, Eddie Clark said I would get paid for it. I basically just threw that in there to confuse him. And boy, was he confused. He was scratching his head for a minute and trying to figure out. He knew Eddie Clark was somebody that had some authority that could get stuff paid. But then he yelled, he said, Eddie Clark works for Chrysler. And everybody busted out laughing on that because Eddie Clark couldn't get me paid for any Ford job at all, you know. All right, so Sammy was a guy that I went to have lunch with now and again, and he worked in a new car department. He found an air tool behind the seat of a brand new truck he was pre-delivering. And this is the tool. This tool right here is the tool I'm talking about. I don't know if you've seen one of these or not, but this thing right here, when he found it, I noticed I would see Sammy over there working with this thing. And everybody knew that he found it in there, and it was a big old air motor. You turn this knob right here to go from forward to reverse. It's got a ring gear and a pinion in here, and it was already kind of worn whenever he found it. It was beat up about like this. And if you look on the barrel of it, if you look at it really carefully in the light just right, you'll notice that it's got the Stanley logo on it, the Stanley Air Tools. And I knew that Mac and Stanley were kind of joined at the hip even then. And so I needed to see about keeping this thing going because it was a really strong air gun. And I would say, you know, I wonder how much it would cost to buy one of these things, you know, because I really like this thing. Boy, I'm telling you, it doesn't impact or anything, but it was a really strong tool for tightening stuff. I'd see Sammy standing under a truck holding it like this and pull the trigger with an extension on it, and it would jerk him around like that when he hit bottom. And there was almost nothing this thing wouldn't snatch out of there whenever you pull that little trigger right there. Well, the point is, the Mac tool guy managed to get a catalog that had tools like this in it. This tool right here, and this was years ago now, but he told me if you wanted to buy a tool like this, you would pay $3,000 for one of these. That's what they cost new, but that's an assembly line grade tool. Now, in the engine assembly plants, like I made several trips to the Power Stroke plant up there, they don't use air tools building engines. I know they don't. I don't know about all the engine plants, but I know if you're using electric power tools, if the people that are assembling them are using electric power tools, they're going to be putting stuff in a certain order. And there's a computer that's keeping track of how many turns that bolt turns. Each one, it knows which bolt you're tightening. It knows how many turns it made, how much torque was put on it. If there's all kinds of stuff you can basically, all kind of data points you can get with an electric power tool that you cannot get with an air power tool. These were for building the rest of the car. You know, on an engine, torque is critical. And the international people, when they were building those Power Stroke engines, they basically had a whole database that went with every engine about every bolt, how many turns it made, when, you know, what the torque was, and whether they tightened all the bolts, you know, and all this kind of stuff. It would, and if they had a warranty claim on that, they would go back and look at and see if that was a problem that had been caused whenever the guy was putting it together. One way or another, I traded Sammy a regular half worn out air ratchet for this tool because he said he didn't like it because it was too long, it was too bulky and all that. So I handed him that tool, he handed me this one, and I went back to my service bay with it. But Sammy says, now if you change your mind, I'll trade back with you, you know. And I said, no, that's okay. Once I trade, I don't ever trade back. And a bunch of the other mechanics got mad because they wanted this tool, and they came over there and they were making these little snarky remarks about saying, when I trade, I don't ever trade back. You know, they were acting like they'd give him 3 brand new air ratchets for it if he'd trade back with him. And he says, no, he said he don't ever trade back. Anyway, I still got this thing. Now I will tell you, the little ring gear and the pinion in the head of this thing, there's a little place to grease it right there, broke. And I mean, actually it chipped a tooth off right, it got where it wouldn't work very well. And so I stopped using it. But I could have bought a set of gears for this, but a set of gears was over $100. And at the time, I just couldn't see myself getting off that money. I mean, you know, I don't even know if I can still get them now. But the Mac man told me that's what they would cost. Anyway, I just wanted to tell you about that. Now, going on, let me get my little clicker here. Moving along here, this Cherokee, this 18-year-old kid came in there on like a 96 Cherokee with a 4-liter, and the alternator wouldn't put out. But it had 27,000 miles on it. And I think the warranty on those was only 24,000 or something like that. And so his was out of warranty. The alternator wasn't putting out. When I got to checking it out, the alternator wire on that darn thing was just bent. I mean, was burned off. I'm talking about not the wire, but the big post where the alternator. And it was like they had left it loose. Somebody had, probably at the factory, and it had jittered around arcing on that post until it just burned the post slam off, and the post was kind of welded to the eyelet and all that. And so I says, well, you know, at the dealership, in a situation like that, we didn't ever order parts to take the alternators apart and fix them, although I had done that on some other vehicles. But the call was made that it needed an alternator. Well, he was wandering around the showroom up there, and he had met some little gal that thought he was good looking. He was kind of a big football player looking boy, about 18, 19 years old. He had that girl on his arm, and he was walking around the showroom, and I went and found him, and I said, this thing's going to have an alternator. It's going to be $275 to parts and labor for the alternator to put it on there. And so, of course, on that one, you know, you could go in from the bottom, but because I had a flat stall, I would take the battery box out and all that hogwash and put it in, go in there from the top and do it. And I was going to have to put a different terminal on the wire and all that, and everything like that. So the general manager knew this kid's dad, and so he came out here and he says, get one of those new Jeeps out there and take the alternator off of it and put it, well, that's double work, but it gets it going today because we didn't have one in stock. And so I went ahead and pulled it in, you know, pulled that other Jeep in there next to his, and I, you know, took the alternator off of both of them, and I put the alternator off of the new vehicle on his, and got it all buckled up, and, you know, and put the soldered a new eyelet on there with some, you know, heat shrink around the base of it and all that, so it looked real neat. And put it on there, tightened it up, got it charging and all that kind of stuff. Well, by the time we got up there, and you know, this is where the thing was. Well, the general manager is one told me to do that. So he didn't want to say no to the repair when he had the girl on his arm because he was trying to impress her. Well, so now he got up there to the cashier one day and he said, I don't have the money to pay for this, and I'm not paying nobody $275. Well, the work had already been done. And so then the general manager tells me to swap the alternator out again. So I was a little bit disgruntled about that, like just about anybody would be. And when I put that alternator back on there, I used that air tool I just showed you, and I tightened that sucker up just real tight. I mean, I did some torque to yield on that thing just about, because that thing would just about break your arm. It was that strong whenever it hit the bottom when you were spinning it. It was a steady pull. It didn't do like an air ratchet. Long and short of it is, I tightened that thing up really good. Put a piece of shrink tubing over the island that was swinging there so that it wouldn't short out against something, because the alternator I put back on his was the one that had the burned off post. Well, He took the Jeep to an alternator shop, they pulled it apart and they fixed it and all that. Then he tries to get us in trouble. We didn't charge him nothing, basically. He tries to get us in trouble by telling his dad, who has come back in town, that we didn't do any of the work that we said we were supposed to have done. You know, he claims the alternator shop. May have been because the bolts were so tight, I don't know. But anyway, the general manager brought him back out there, and what the general manager liked to do is he liked to put the guy that's accusing you of something, looking you straight in the eye and accusing you, to see how you react to it. You know, and over in Proverbs it says the righteous is as bold as a lion. You know, if you're telling the truth, you know, the guilty flee when none pursueth, but the righteousness is bold as a lion. And I was not afraid of this guy because I knew that I was telling the truth, that I had actually done the work that I said I had done. Furthermore, if he wanted to argue about it, the front end man over there that worked right next door, he had seen me do all that stuff. Anyway, as I told him, I says, I actually did this work. I don't care what anybody says. And when him and the general manager were walking off, he says, the general manager says, I'm not going to question what that mechanic says because he always tells the truth. Now, this is a good lesson. Always let your yes be yes and your no be no. You know, if you're always somebody that tells the truth, then they will believe you when you say yes or no. You don't have to swear, I swear I did it right this time or whatever. All you got to do is say yes or no. If you mess up, just say you messed up. You know, that's the thing. All right. Billy, the transmission mechanic, he was an older man that had been there a lot longer than I had. And I was doing transmissions at the time, you know, working there right next to him. And so the first time I had any dealings with him, was that I went over there and I says, what do you use to disconnect these transmission cooler lines? You know, because they had those little double duck bills where you snap the transmission in, you know, transmission line in. And they had this little special tool that OTC makes. It's a little knurled and you slide it in there and it holds the little things and you pull it out, you know. And he says, this is the one that belongs to the dealership, but he says, since I'm the one that does most of the transmission work, I keep this in my toolbox. And I said, well, that's pretty darn cool. I hadn't seen one of those before, and at the time, I've seen a bunch of them now. You can buy them everywhere in every parts store. But at the time, they were, you know, sort of not too many of them around. So he loans it to me. I use it. I give it back to him, and I go into the tool truck, and I pay $11 for a new one that he had. It was an OTC tool. A Cornwell guy had one. So I put it in my box. And I said, I got one of these now, I don't need to use that one anymore. Well, he lost the one that belonged to the shop. And so he started borrowing the one I bought. And so he borrowed it and borrowed it and borrowed it and borrowed it. And finally, I says, let me just give you this one because it looks like you're going to have it a lot, and I'll just buy me another one. So I gave him that one, and I bought me another one. And he lost the one I gave him and came borrowing the second one. And that just really drives you up the wall. You know, and I worked with the guy every day. So I also had this pair of channel lock pliers, and if I'd have thought about it, I'd have got them and brought them in here and shown, you know, held them up in front of the thing. You know, big 14-inch channel locks, and they had the curved jaws. And they worked really well for popping this transmission linkage loose. You know, where the transmission linkage, it pops through that little grommet there where it hooked to the transmission, those older Fords. And he could use that and pop that thing out real easy. And he borrowed those pliers 3 times a day or something like that. And finally, and I had my name written on Richard, you know, I had them written on the little curved jaw of the thing so I would know they were mine. They were Channel Lock brand. And so, and I'd had them a long time too. And so he said, he borrowed them, and I said, just take those and keep them over there where you're at, and I'll get them from you if I need them. I was just trying to be neighborly and all that. And then one day I went back way on the other end of the shop down there. We had this great big old industrial grade steam cleaner, you know, in a place in there where we steam clean parts and all. And I saw my channel locks laying on top of that steam cleaner, the ones I had loaned him, and I don't know how long they'd been laying there, but I just said, well, these are mine. So I picked them up and I took them back to my toolbox. And just to see what he would say, I went over there to him and I says, Billy, do you know where those channel locks are? Because I need to see them. And he just launched into a big screaming and hollering and cussing fit. I think the psychologists call that a defense mechanism, because basically he just that was him basically acting really ugly so he wouldn't have to tell me that he had lost my channel locks and he didn't know where they were. But I put those in my back in my toolbox in a different place, and he never asked to borrow them again because he didn't know that I had found them on the steam cleaner. If I'd have told him, he'd have wanted to borrow them again. The little radio tools, you know, like first time I ever saw those on Volkswagens, you know, where you got the little horseshoe-shaped radio tools you stick in there, and it releases these catches. You pull a radio out. Volkswagen started doing that a long time, but Ford was doing it too. And so rather than buying the new radio tools, I would get a 1/8 welding rod, and grind all the flux off of it, and then I would cut it, I think 7 inches long. Well, one welding rod would make a set of tools. I would cut it in the middle, because a welding rod's about 14 inches long, and I'd mark it in the middle, and I'd cut it, and I would bend it around a 1 1/16 chrome socket, and I would make it was just exactly the right spacing when I did it that way. And before I did that, I even ground the little ball on the end of it on the grinder. It takes a little, ingenuity to make it little round balls on. And I could take those radios out with my own tools then. Well, the service riders found out I had some of those, and every time they needed to take somebody's radio out to send it off for repair, they would come get my dadgum radio tools. And so I says, okay, well, in order to try to be a good neighbor, I went ahead and got some old welding rods. And when I say old welding rods, there were some that were, when they've been stored in a place where they're wet, you can't really use them anymore because they don't weld worth a toot. They need to be kept warm and dry. I ground those off. I made a set of those radio tools for each service rider, 3 service riders out there. And I made each one of them a pair of those radio tools. And so, because see, that way I'm not irritated every time they want to come borrow mine. I've actually made them some, gave them to them, didn't charge them a penny. And so every one of those service riders lost the tools that I made for them and came back wanting to borrow mine. And that just makes you want to tear your hair out, I mean, I always went the extra mile to try to make sure that I was good to these guys. And I don't know how many times. This other guy, there was a Ford that had a Duraspark module. It was one of the older ones, and I found out that the little Duraspark module had a wire that was compromised there, and right there at the little blue grommet some kind of way. And I did some solder work, and I fixed that thing so I could use that module for a test unit. If I was thinking, well, I'll try the module first. If you got one of your own, you can just plug that in. And so I had one of those modules that I kept in my toolbox for that. And this dandy guy that always wore shiny boots and all that kind of stuff, and was always making sure he was just fixed, you'd think, I don't even know, he was just way too neat and shiny cowboy boots and all to be. Well, he came over there one day and he says, I hear you've got a Duraspark module over here that you use for testing. And I said, yeah, I got one right here in the box. And he says, well, I need to borrow that. And so I loaned it to him. And he told me sometime later, he goes, I put your module back in your box, and I happened to open the drawer that module was in, and there was a different module in there that had green paint on it. And I knew at that time what he had done. He had put my module on a car that he had troubleshot for some reason or another, and given me the old crummy module that was on the box. And when I confronted him about it, he acted like he didn't know what I was talking about. These people think you're downright stupid, Put a different module in there with green paint on it. It's not even the same brand. And they act like, oh, no, I'll put your module back. There was a shop foreman one time, a young shop foreman, not the older guy that looked like Slim Pickens. He kept borrowing my test light. I had a snap-on test light, one of them with the rubbery cord like you see. And I'd had that thing for a long time. And one day he borrowed my test light about 4 or 5 times. I don't know what his deal was. But the last time he borrowed it, it didn't come back. And I says, where is my test light? And he said, oh, I put it back in your toolbox. Don't you just love that kind of thing? Anyway, there's a lot of borrowers out there. There's this other guy borrowed a socket, oxygen sensor socket that I had. It was OTC, and OTC don't guarantee doodly nothing, And I said, don't bust my socket, because if you bust it, you bought it. And he brought it back busted and just smiled and walked away, Anyway, that's the kind of stuff you got to deal with sometimes when you're working with a lot of other mechanics. And there was another guy that had a really nice new set of tools, and he would come over there and borrow my fuel line disconnect tools, the little colored ones. And he would say, let me borrow your fuel line disconnect. I said, wait a minute. I said, are you going to buy a set of tools when the tool man comes? And he really didn't want to answer that question. He says, "Don't give me a hard time. I just want to borrow your fuel line tools." I said, you got a set of brand new tools over there. You need to buy some tools. You know, if you can't afford to buy a set of fuel line tools, then you're in the wrong business. You need to be doing something else. But anyway, I never wanted to make it free and easy for anybody, because if you do, they take advantage of you. When I was teaching at the college, I would have students that would come in there and want me to give them a fuse, and I'd say, well, I got some fuses in my car that belong to me, but I'm not going to give you any fuses that belong to the college, because the college doesn't owe you a fuse. If you got a work order I can charge it out on, I'll do that. Bolts, nuts. One of my students one time, she said, can I pour some of this windshield washer stuff in my car and bring you another gallon tomorrow? I says, well, while you're at it, why don't you go ahead and take a couple of quarts of oil out of the room and put some gas in your car out of the tanker. Just go ahead and steal whatever you can. Well, she kind of got mad at me about that. But the long and the short of it is, anytime somebody can take advantage of a situation and, you know, go crazy borrowing or, you know, taking stuff and not giving it back and all, they'll typically do that. And I always try to teach my students not to be that kind of a person. Anyway, that's about the end of what I got for you today. This is some, hope you haven't been too bored with me just telling stories, but occasionally I think of these things whenever it's during the week, and I say, well, one of these days I'm just going to have a session, you know, where I tell stories and all. But I appreciate you guys listening, and I'll talk to you next time.